going to talk about his father, the United States attorney that opened an investigation on the Salazar slaying. And if everyone could gather around, Richard and I'm very excited that you're going to give this talk. And we've been talking sort of very casually about this for a couple of months. And what we decided, what we agreed upon, we're obviously not here to make canonical statements on Salazar's death, but Richard is here to talk about the motivation of his father, and the motivation of his father around the Salazar slaying was that there were questions that had not been answered by investigations by the sheriff's department, and so he, as a U.S. prosecutor, decided to attempt to get those questions answered. I'm going to run back to the bus. Richard will probably mention an article in Newsweek from 1971. I've made about 30 copies of it. I'm going to run back to the bus right now and grab them and pass them out, and you can, Richard, take it away.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about my dad. He died in 1972 at the age of 49, so it's been a long time. The bottom line was he was what is now an extinct species. He was a liberal Republican. And in our house, despite all of us being Protestants of different stripes, the only really sacred concept in our family as I was growing up was the Constitution. And I was taught at a very early age to take it very seriously, as was my father. That said, he was sworn into office in early 1970. He'd been nominated by then President Nixon, or nominated by a U.S. Senator named George Murphy, yes, the song and dance guy, and from California, and appointed by Nixon and confirmed in the Senate to be U.S. Attorney. If for any of us who were alive in 1970, taking a page from Dickens, I guess, they were the best of times and they were the worst of times. The war was raging, and Nixon pledged a law and order administration. Well, okay, so he had a Republican appointee who then was in a city, which, as we've seen going through BOYLE HEIGHTS, or heard about the history of it, was in great tumult, not just because of the war, but because of minority dissent and complaint about law enforcement, particularly LAPD and the LA County Sheriff's offices. That said, coming specifically to the Salazar case, that was a matter for the county, the LA County Sheriff, to break up the riot, or the riot resulted from their behavior or vice versa. That's a different investigation and local exclusively. However, at the end of the investigation, and as you heard, the televised autopsy hearing and all this sort of stuff, East Los Angeles, particularly citizens of BOYLE Heights, and my mother and grandmother were born in Lincoln Heights, and I've got ancestors buried there in BOYLE Heights on my mother's side. The point was the community wasn't going to sit still, and with the results of the inquest, and my father interviewed and his deputies, more importantly the assistant U.S. attorneys at the Department of Justice, interviewed people, eyewitnesses and what have you, even some of the folks who'd been in the Silver Dollar when Salazar had been killed. He was unsatisfied, not personally but professionally, with the disposition of the federal issues which surround the Constitution and the civil rights to not only of Ruben Salazar but of all of those who had been involved in the community at that time. It's important to remember that while a riot did break out, if it broke out in your backyard, you'd be involved, and that's kind of what went on. So my father began a federal investigation to determine, more precisely than the local investigations had, what had happened. His decision was not met with popular support of the LA County Sheriff, who was a gentleman at the time, who's passed away since, Peter Pitchess. What compounded Pitchess's dismay, aside from the questioning of his authority and that of his department. My father, he had been a mentor to my father in a lot of ways politically. Many times I was in their home and they were in ours. Well, that ended. And the sheriff remained silent on it, but the mayor, Sam Yorty, and Chief Davis of the LAPD didn't. So all of this was receiving a tremendous amount of attention, plus because it was the federal government and not all the people involved were here on a naturalized or green card or basis, they were reluctant to, apprehensive about, skeptical about, and reluctant to talk to federal authorities. At any rate, for a couple of 3 months, the investigation went on with all of the hoopla in the newspaper. Needless to say, the Justice Department we're carrying out our duties, which are to investigate breach of constitutional issues and determine what had led to, and also to determine, because the community believed that the killing of Salazar was deliberate. Anyway, he forwarded his case to a grand jury, federal grand jury, and they chose not to indict the officer or the management of the LA County Sheriffs, and one would think that was it. But as Richard alluded to earlier on, the 7th Street shootings occurred over on Skid Row. Vietnam veteran.
They had occurred about 3 months earlier.
Correct. So all of this stuff led to repeated federal investigations. Long story short, this was not precise. I mentioned earlier there are 80 U.S. attorneys. Well, the U.S. attorneys answer to the U.S. Attorney General, and the Attorney General answers to the President. The Attorney General when my father entered office was a gentleman named John Mitchell, who became famous in Watergate, and the President was Richard Nixon. This was not what they had envisioned their appointee to be doing, to put it rather mildly. Other cases, including the Daniel Ellsberg case and what have you, which was, they ordered my father to indict him, he determined he wasn't indictable, and then they said to my father, you're not so healthy anymore, you're going to say you've got health issues and you're going to resign.
Wait, let me interrupt you, because maybe people didn't hear that. Your father was asked to indict Daniel Ellsberg.
Well, it's completely irrelevant to Ruben Salazar, but not at all irrelevant to civil rights. Daniel Ellsberg and his partner, a fellow named, not his academic co-worker, was a fellow named Anthony Russo, were at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California, in the Central Federal District, when the Pentagon Papers were downloaded over the ARPA network, the predecessor to the internet. The documents had been declassified. WikiLeaks, anybody heard that? And this was sort of the precursor to that. And the point was the database was in the Pentagon, which, although technically it's in Virginia, it's in the District of Columbia. Where did the crime occur? Where did the alleged crime occur? Well, in those days, 1971, there was no way in heck the Justice Department in D.C. was going to get an indictment of anyone. They were under indictment. So they said, we know what we'll do. We'll ask our appointee, Bob Meyer, to indict Ellsberg. After an exhaustive investigation, he came to the conclusion that no crime had been committed. If the RAND Corporation wished to prefer civil charges on an employee basis, that's another matter, but it's not a federal one. That's when they told my father, indict him or tell the public you're sick and that you need to leave for health reasons. He says, I'm not sick, despite the fact he died shortly thereafter. He wasn't sick, and as you can see in the photograph, besides he was 48 years old, 49 years old, 48. And he said, I'm not sick, and if you fire me now, imagine what the media are going to do with it. So they said, okay, we'll wait until this blows over, and then we'll fire you, which is precisely what they did. This is relevant to the Salazar case in that, tangentially, since Sheriff Pitchess was so angry, he waited until my father left office and tried to return to private practice on a solo basis. He'd held a firm, corporate firm before, of his own. Sheriff Pitches went around Los Angeles telling his clientele, corporate clientele, with some fairly large names, Capitol Records, Diamond Match, others. If you do business with Bob Meyer, the president won't like it. And if you've heard, there was an enemies list, my father's name was on it. The family was followed, and I was, and what have you. The point is, as tangential to the Salazar thing, that really broke the camel's back relative to Peter Pitches, who was probably the most powerful person in the history of LA law enforcement, with the possible exception of the Shaw brothers back in the Prohibition days. But anyway, that's the whole story, and that is to what happened at the Silver Dollar. The determination of the investigation was it was an accidental homicide. I learned just this morning that, as you see in the LA Times, that the Sheriff's Department is disgorging files in this matter. Those files were reputed in that day to have gone missing or not be findable. So here we are nigh on 40 years later, and they seem to have turned up. But my personal opinion notwithstanding, I think all it's going to show is probably, as the paper alludes today, negligence, not malice. But and Rosario Munoz, who was the leader of the Chicano moratorium with my father's service, which was rather well attended, came up to me and gave me a Mexican flag. So I guess Bob Meyer was pretty popular in East Los Angeles. That's it.
How did he die, your dad?
How did he die?
So much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions for Richard?
How did he die? Well, he was down in Orange County. Talked to an Aunt Helena about Orange County. And he was representing a former fraternity brother from college days in what he swore he'd never do, a family matter, custody matter. He was in court, he exhibited discomfort that was prelude to a massive heart attack he had behind the wheel of his car as he was pulling out of the parking lot. Just to add a little bit of whodunit to the whole thing, his deputy U.S. attorney, and a deputy U.S. attorney is not the same thing as an assistant U.S. attorney. Deputy U.S. attorneys are what they call lifers. They hold that position virtually indefinitely, and they help transition between political appointees. His deputy, who just retired, I think, 10 years ago, maybe a little more, came up to me at the service and he said, "Don't believe everything you read in the newspaper." Well, whatever killed him, I saw him afterwards. He was dead. But, his press secretary at the United States Attorney Office said he died of a broken heart because he was defending the Constitution. His party had turned its back on him. It's quasi-profile and courage. But in the article you have there, he wasn't somebody you wanted to mess with. I'll give you an example. When I was a little boy, if he wanted to get the truth out of me, he swore me in. I'm not. Yeah. Well, I guess I could tell.
Speak up a little bit.
Yeah. I was in college in my sophomore year at USC when my father died. And I'm 56 years old, and I am what is properly known as a hippie. I don't look it now, but hey. I had hair like this, and my father would introduce me. He didn't like it very much, and he would introduce me to his friends as his daughter, Richard. I got a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office where he used me as a waiter and a busboy and different things and wouldn't pay me. To come down immediately from his secretary who he'd had for his whole career, working with him. And she sounded ticked off, and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Don't question it. Be here inside a half an hour." Well, the federal courthouse is not very far from USC, so I hot-footed it down there in a bus and walked in, and she gave me an ugly look, and okay. And I walked into his office, and the the U.S. Attorney's Office, and there was a guy sitting across the desk from my dad. He looked really familiar, and he had long hair and stuff like that. And my father said, "Sit down." And he said, "This is Special Agent," and I forget the name. "Have you ever seen him before?" And I said, "Kinda." In order to get my father out of office, amongst the things they did, and you got to understand, the name J. Edgar Hoover was very real at that time. Actually, he died. Pat Gray was the FBI director, but under Hoover, an investigation had been created with this fellow who was an FBI agent to try to frame me up as a drug dealer.
Oh.
And because I'd had a phone conversation with someone in Arizona, it made it a federal matter, and they had this agent build a dossier that figures never lie, liars figure. This agent in due conscience couldn't do it. And the FBI answers to the Justice Department now. In those days, it was an autonomous agency. And as you recall, Johnson made Hoover head for life. And anyway, my father said, if it hadn't been for this agent's conscience, you'd be going to the federal slammer and there'd be nothing I could do to get you out. And he said, this is not acceptable. And he said it in a rather colorful way. And at any rate, I mean, we were followed, our phones were tapped. When you pick up the phone and you hear someone talking and then they go, oops, and you hear a dial tone, you kind of know something's up. But, like I said, the best of times, the worst of times, and the Constitution prevailed. That just as we've seen many justice officials, including the current U.S. Attorney, who happens to be the first African-American U.S. Attorney, Andre Barat. We'll see what he has to say about what's in the Times today. But the bottom line is, if local law enforcement can't police itself, and as my father says in that article, the prosecutor makes somebody mad every day. But the trick was the history of he was pro-law enforcement, all that sort of stuff, but when people's rights get trammeled, the federal government tends to intervene, and unfortunately when people condemn the government, think about what you'd do if they didn't exist. That's the bottom line, and he had no desire to stay in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Interestingly, his predecessor, Matt Byrne, heard the Ellsberg case and kicked it out of court. They sent in a special prosecution team to do it, and they got thrown out of court.
Richard, thank you.
Thank you.
Great.